one got anything at all orchestral version by Dead by April, apparently a new release. Um, I think it sounds okay. Um, I kind of just scrolled through YouTube Music's new releases for things that I wasn't going to absolutely be abhorrent by. And, uh, straight out, I am aggressively annoyed as I start this. Not necessarily because of Phantasy Star Online 2, New Genesis, and OBS not cooperating with each other. Okay, I get it. My graphics card is, by this point, approaching its 10-year birthday. Uh, and it really needs to be replaced. There's just no good option to replace it. Or at least, I'm not willing to spend the money to replace it. If I had that kind of good cash to spend. Okay. But what really just trumped all over my toes is there is a popular gaming site out there. You've probably heard of it, called Kotaku. And Kotaku had this. I think it was Kotaku. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Kotaku. I don't want to go back and look it up now since I'm kind of in the middle of this. Kotaku had a story up about how the upcoming game from Square Enix for Spoken has a quote-unquote black character, but no black representation. And I'm not even sure where to start with this. Okay, I do know where to start. For starting, the African descendants who were captured by socialist warlords, their own countrymen, either given a choice of being executed or put on a ship and be sold as slaves. You had British and American and other nationalities, French, German, Spanish, the Mediterranean countries, so Greece, Italy, all realizing that either they buy those slaves and get them out of there, or the slaves die. Okay, so that the traders did the right thing. The traders, Traders, traders did the right thing to get the African slaves being sold by their warlords out of Africa. I don't think anyone can question that was absolutely the right thing to do. It was the Christian thing to do. It was we will get you out of here, we will get you to a better life. And on the same side of that was the right thing to do, then oppressing the slaves who were taken from Africa and taken from other ships, all of the French, Greece, Italian, pick a nationality here that had a sailing ship that was taken captive by pirates or by privateers working for another country flag and then sold as slaves. I mean, so I feel like I'm revisiting history here. I've already done this in previous streams where I've talked about the idea that the slave population in America or worldwide was solely made up of African Americans is completely false and insulting to every single nationality who at some point have been kept as a slave by some other country. It's going through history, everyone's taken slaves, so everyone's ancestors, they got a slave somewhere. May not have been an African slave, but they got a slave somewhere. So it's, and where I think it hurt the intelligence to even consider is the conflation of the modern day, if you will, the modern day expectation that there should be reparations for something that ancestors did. No, there's nobody alive today who is deserving of a reparation for an ancestor having engaged in a slave trade, whether or not their ancestor was a slave owner or their ancestor was the slave themselves. Because at that point in human history, everyone's got at least one slave in their ancestry. Everyone. And no, I'm not being facetious, or I think I'm overstating it. Is looking at the population maps, looking at the wars that are known about, looking at how the history has evolved over the years, what we can track by verbal, written, and other sources of history. And if you're wondering what other sources of history are, you have indentations marked that are left in the ground, bodies that are left buried, signs of fabric architecture, not necessarily what's written down, but actions that were taken that left an impact on a culture that changed the way a culture worked. We can definitely state that at that point, everyone has an ancestor who had been a slave. Maybe they were a slave uh, of the Chinese government. Maybe they were a slave of the Muslims. Maybe they were a slave of American. Maybe they were a slave of the Grecian. Maybe they were a slave of the Spanish. Everyone's got an ancestor who was a slave. Saying that your ancestry, because you had slaves in it, entitles you to something is insulting to literally everyone else around you who has an ancestor who was also a slave. Stop it. Just knock it off. Scam's over. Alright, and what really ticked me off about this is when you're creating a fantasy world, and I write Calair, I help others come up with ways to define their fictional worlds. I had an author, recently recognized as a grand something, who was, offering writing tips, and does anyone else here? And I made some kind of snarky comments like, what, you need help? And going, no, what I need a better utility to keep track of the world building, because I do massive amounts of world building and sometimes get lost to where the story is because I'm concentrating on, well, how do the economics here function? Why would slavery make sense for this population? And okay, what if and I actually like an approach that Mass Effect took where when the player had the realization, you're a slave. No, I'm an indentured servant. I want to sell my services. They can use my services and play convince them to buy me. And I really loved how that turned it on a head, because that was a very modern take, and congrats to, I don't say a lot of nice things about BioWare, but that was a brilliant piece of writing there. It really was. But keeping that in mind, kind of, when you're creating a fictional world, and Forspoken does not take place in our world, it does not take place in our dimension. At least as far as we know, it doesn't. It takes place in a world where there are magical powers. It takes place in a world where there's an alternate history. The person the star of Forspoken, might have a darker skin color. Their melatonin content of their... I'm sure I got that name right. The melatonin content of their skin may indeed be higher than some of the other people that are around them. They may have a deeper tan. But they are not going to be, because their world is not ours, they are not going to have the same cultural history as our world. They're not going to have the same stigmas in place where necessarily things are determined by differences of skin color. In fact, it would actually be very awkward depending on where things are happening at. And you can go all the way back to biblical times and look at how the Samaritans were treated. And the Samaritans were of a different skin color. But the Good Samaritan, there were Samaritans who were known as good people and were accepted among the other nations. Kind of a damning indictment on your actions are what define you, not your skin color. And various science fiction television shows, writings have taken shots at when the only thing that separates you is the different to tell that you're different. You don't really have a problem there. You're just being a jerk. And from my perspective, as someone who helps others create worlds, who helps others create fiction, uh, the idea that when you have someone who has a darker skin content in a game, that they have to be stereotypical black. As in, they gotta talk like they from the hood. They gotta talk using their phonics. They ain't gotta know much. They gotta be stupid. Newsflash, Kotaku, you're racist! Let me repeat that. Kotaku, you are the racist. That was the most racist article I have seen that didn't involve National Socialist Germany talking about it's better to shoot 2 poles too many than 2 poles too less. You're that far to the left. Do you get it? You are the racist if you bring up, well, it's a black character and she's not acting black and the developer doesn't have enough black representation. You're the racist! You are! Not the developer! You! It's not that hard to understand. I mean, it really isn't. And the worst part is that there are people who are going to be visiting Kotaku day after day, swallowing that excrement, looking and going, oh, they must know what they're talking about. They're a successful website. No, they're not. Newsflash, Gawker got shut down. They lost all their money, and they had to sell out to Univision, who's using profit from another business to keep the website afloat. No, Kotaku's not a success. Their traffic numbers don't show it. Their profit numbers don't show it. Their advertising doesn't show it. Why the hell is Google pushing Kotaku stories into my Android newsfeed? Because it's propaganda. It's not that hard to understand that repeating a lie over and over, that black Americans today are entitled to reparations of slavery when literally everyone around them at this point has, if you really want to go down that route of black Americans are entitled to reparations because their ancestors may have been a slave in America during the time of the Civil War and the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, newsflash, the colonists who came over from England, the Protestant Christians, were fleeing persecution because they were being kept as slaves. They had, the saying is, no taxation without representation. The colonies were being kept as slaves by the British Empire. They had to pay what the British Empire demanded. All the colonists were slaves. Every single one. It's not hyperbole. It's not an exaggeration. It's why they fled the British Empire. It's why they decided that, you know what, it's going to be better for us to go across an ocean, to risk our lives in a transatlantic journey, to weather the storm, to set up on this continent with no support, no farms, no nothing, rely on the locals. And we're going to have to hope that this pans out because this is a better life than what we had in England. Not that hard to understand. It really isn't. All of the colonists, every single one, were slaves of the British Empire. They threw the yoke of the British Empire off and said, you know what? You're not going to treat us like subjects. You're going to treat us like slaves. We're kicking you out. And that's the same kind of violent response that the left is pushing again today. It's either the left is not satisfied until everyone has their head bowed and their knees bent and they're genuflecting toward the socialist empire. Well, it's not going to happen. And articles like the one Kotaku pushed, where you have to tilt your head at the sheer inanity of it. You're talking about a game that's a completely different world, and you want this character to be a racist stereotype, and because they're not a racist stereotype, and the developers don't have anyone who's familiar with that racist stereotype to make that a racist stereotype, and you're upset about it, you are the racist, you are the problem, you are the socialist. This is why things cannot end well on the current trajectory. We maybe have a couple of elections left in the United States where you can just not vote Democrat. Now, I'm not telling you to vote Republican, because if we saw today with Liz Cheney, just because somebody has a Republican tag on their election sheet doesn't mean that they're actually Republican. The question you should be asking is, are they a foundationalist? Not are they a conservative. Not do they have physical conservative policy, but are they a foundationalist? Do they have a foundational belief that they build upon? Do they want a stable country to build upon? What do they believe in terms of government? Do they want a limited government? Limited government is good. And this is something else we're seeing a lot. The Stop the Grinches bill, which is supposed to stop online bots from buying up computer hardware. Well, newsflash, a lot of times those aren't bots. Those are either Indian or Chinese slaves, for lack of a better word. Yes, I am going to harp on that, who are being paid not much money to sit and just click over and over. It's not necessarily a computer application that is hammering a web page. And in a lot of cases where you have almost an effective unlimited manpower, where you can have 200 people sitting in a crowded warehouse on tiny little laptops just clicking away on one link until they get something. No bots law doesn't actually do anything. And there's also the larger question at hand at who on earth is going to enforce a no bots law? Who has legal jurisdiction over a website or a business that is based in Canada, based in Mexico, based in England, based in France, based in Spain, based somewhere else in the EU, based in China, based in Japan, based in North Korea, based in South Korea? Who has the legal jurisdiction to cover where a site's actually hosted? It's the U.S. Congress? They certainly don't. U.S. Justice Department? They certainly don't. U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation? They sure as hell don't. U.S. Federal Trade Commission? Might levy sanctions on offending party. But that's about the extent of it. There's actually, what about, not even the FEC, the Electronics Commission, not even they would have the authority to, when you see a couple of postal trucks go by and go, didn't you just go through? Anyways, not even they would have the authority to implement and enforce that kind of bill. So the Stop Grinch bill is one of those. It does nothing. It can't do anything because there's no legal framework for such a bill to be enforced. And it's not going to stop the people who are arranging the sales of these ODM and OEM, original design manufacturer and original equipment manufacturer items that are coming out of countries that aren't the United States. Graphics cards are not currently being made in the United States. So graphic cards that are bought may not necessarily be shipped from the United States. They may be shipped from a warehouse that's located in a different country. So that whole stop the bots thing, stop the Grinch bill, it literally can do nothing because it can't. I assure you, other countries are going to take issue if somebody in the Biden administration says, you know what, you're going to have to not allow robots on your site, when it may not even be robots. It may just be a group of underpaid slaves being told you do this or you die. It really is that simple. But it looks good on paper even if it does nothing. And that's kind of, we see that with socialist things everywhere. It's we're going to be in control, but we're not actually responsible. So what happens when the law, if it passes, what happens when it inevitably fails? And you got a lot of disappointed consumers. That's kind of, you have to really ask deep questions about the person who you're electing. What do they actually stand for? And then you have to hold it to them. Liz Cheney does not stand for anything the Republican Party says it's supposed to stand for. She just proved that out loud. She's claiming the U.S. Congress has the authority of a U.S. Judicial of the U.S. judicial branch, and it doesn't. And this has come back several times from the Supreme Court and lower level court that no, Congress does not actually have judicial authority. The judicial branch has judicial authority. So this is not going to end well for Liz Cheney. This is going to end very well for Mark Meadows, because as she continues on this path, Liz Cheney has opened herself up to some very dangerous laws that Mark Meadows could act upon. So this is something you got to keep in mind. Just because somebody says they are of one party or another doesn't necessarily mean they actually are. Another good example on the other side is Vernon Jones in Georgia. Now, I don't agree with his statement that he's the only person who can beat Stacey Abrams, because Stacey Abrams, her only strength is her election fraud capabilities. That's all she brings to the table, is she has an extensive election fraud network. Well, if you take the election fraud out, which is going to be very likely after the audits and everything else that are going on and the number of parties that are involved, I don't think Stacey Abrams is going to be another factor in a Georgia election. She's not popular in her own party. She's all she brings is an election fraud machine that wore very thin last time, and trying to push her fraud through nearly got her arrested this time. I'm really sorry it didn't. But that's all she's got, and that's not going to be enough to carry an election in Georgia, at least not again. She's either going to need a different fraud machine, which she doesn't have, or she's just going to have to give Georgia up for a governor's stretch and let somebody else be the one to take the shafting. But Vernon Jones, he has demonstrated that despite having been a Democrat for several years, what he actually believes and practices aren't necessarily the things that the Democrats believe in practice. Now, there are some ideological differences, I think, between a foundationalist and Vernon Jones, such as the role of government in the running of a state or a country. But Vernon Jones isn't on board with the murder anyone at any time, Dulcidish empire that the socialist governments routinely push through. I mean, need I say more? What was it? A sarcophagopod, an assisted suicide pod that strangles you. Yeah, that's. Notice which countries that one's being tested in. All socialist countries. Okay, one of them wasn't, but they do have a nanny state, so yeah. And even then, it's not really approved, and there's been some blowback on that. Anyways, it just set me off to see the blatant race baiting from Kotaku. It's playing the race card so egregiously, so obnoxiously, and just, if you're stuck to gaming news, it'd be one thing, but you don't. You're trying to do political commentary, and you're not very good at it. You're trying to do political propaganda, and you're absolutely terrible at that. And about the only thing that's going to, end this is when the money dries out, and when the people who own the money start going to jail and their accounts start getting frozen. How long will that take? I don't have an answer. But I'll be back in a few minutes to actually try and talk about what I originally wanted to talk about, which was the Staff Stone Stalker.